Hi, Jen. Welcome to the Surthriving podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Lisa. So excited to be here.
Yeah, this is super exciting. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have about just therapy and transitioning careers and just women in their 30s and mental health overall. I'm a huge advocate for it. So I'm really excited that I'm finally touching this topic on this podcast.
Yes, thank you so much. Those are all areas I'm passionate about and that resonate with my identity. So I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. So, to start, I ask everyone the same question at the beginning of every episode. You can answer it in any way that you feel comfortable. The question is, are you surviving or thriving?
Yes, I want to say I'm thriving after a long period of surviving.
It's
Yeah.
um it's interesting how with the question right that like that you have to like look inward and kind of see maybe in some
Mhm.
areas you're thriving, some you're surviving. There's really no straightforward answer, which is really what I'm trying to get with like this
Yeah.
podcast in various topics, that there's no one way or cookie cutter answer. Both can exist at the same time for sure.
Part of my work is trying to highlight the parts of our lives where we're thriving, because I think we've all been surviving for a really long time, just outside of the pandemic, like trying to normalize mental health, trying to have deeper connections with ourselves, and especially for women in our 30s. I think we survive a lot of our earlier years, and our 30s are a decade where we can let some of that weight down and start to notice, like, oh, I actually am enjoying my life, or I actually like who I am. So I really appreciate that question because I think it's such a great cultural moment to be asking that.
Well, to start, can you just share with listeners who you are, your background, and how you ended up in mental health services?
I was born and raised in San Francisco, California, in a very sleepy part of San Francisco that was very green, very foggy. I was always at the park or at the beach as a kid. And I was raised by a single mom who was also an immigrant. And so I think from a young age, the ways that I saw the world were very different. Like I was very in tune with my natural environment, very close to the experience of women being raised by a woman and more accustomed to adults and adult conversations, being an only child, versus being able to just fit into a group of kids and care about the same things other kids did. So I think from this early age, I had this suspicion that like there were layers to the world and that people were complicated. And I was so fascinated by relationships because I saw a lot of relationship dynamics growing up. And over time, I think that curiosity manifested itself differently. I went to school in LA and I really loved that experience because LA was like the polar opposite of San Francisco for me. And got my major in English and a minor in philosophy. And I just felt so sparked by like being in smaller classes, being able to just talk and explore with other people. And then after school, I was convinced I wanted to be a creative writer. And after like being in the creative writing world, I felt like it was a little too far in the arts direction. I wanted to be a little more like practically rooted. And I think also as a child of an immigrant, I really wanted to be financially secure. I had seen my mom be financially independent, even if that was really challenging for her. And so I was like, I can write poems in my spare time, but I need to pay rent and be able to like provide for myself without worrying about the following month. And so that led me to shift my career to working in higher education. So I worked in student services at UC Berkeley. And then a friend of mine from high school referred me to a job in the tech industry around 2015. So I started working at this company, Glassdoor, then transitioned to this company, Salesforce, went to a few other small and medium-sized software companies. And it was interesting because I had the financial security. I was making six figures. I was traveling for work and had all these expense trips. I was getting promoted, but there was always something deep down that like wasn't clicking for me. And funny enough, 2018, my 30th birthday, I was like, I don't want to feel this disconnection forever. And there were a lot of people around me in the tech industry that also felt that disconnection, but weren't doing anything about it, whether because they valued financial security over everything else or they just didn't know what else they would do. And so I started to ask myself, like, what are the areas of my life where I've felt the most passionate or the most alive? And it always came back to the human experience. And so I worked with a financial planner. I set up like a 3 to 4 year roadmap to leave tech and have this financial cushion for myself. Said no to a lot of happy hours, a lot of music festivals, so that I could buff up that savings account. And I think at the time I did this, my why became really clear. And so saving money and looking to the future felt really natural. And then I left tech in 2021. I started my marriage and family therapy master's program in September 2021, graduated this past May 2023, and have been a working therapist since October. So it's been a long, windy road with a lot of different views along the way, but I think since making this transition, I really haven't looked back, and I've never had the experience of what I do for work being so much an extension of my identity and how I think about the world. And so I feel extremely lucky and privileged, and like there's a feeling of serendipity in my life that like I'm in the right place at the right time doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and that you're thriving in an area that maybe was kind of deprived a little bit and something that you
Totally.
always recognized. I was just having a conversation with someone else that I recorded with, and it was the conversation around intuition and just doing what you're passionate about. And it
Mhm.
really is something that we just learn in our 30s. I'm about to be 31 in a couple months, and it almost feels like a light switch in a lot of ways. And
Yeah.
I felt seen in a lot of things that you described. And I also want to point out that the path is never straight. And so
Hmm.
you went to a financial planner and said, hey, in 3 to 4 years, this is really where I see myself. How can I do that? And
Right.
so, in a way, you can almost loosely plan how to thrive in your life. And there's
I love
logistical
that.
things yeah, there's logistical things that have to happen in order to get there. But it also is not like instant gratification. We often live in a world where I think a lot of people want that instant gratification. It can be very a hard pill to swallow and a lesson to learn, but there are things
Yeah.
that maybe need to be done when you're like working towards what you want to do, and that it
Hmm.
doesn't happen overnight, and that no feeling surviving versus thriving rate is permanent, I think is what I heard you say a lot.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think you're also hitting on something I noticed transitioning careers, that it's really important to move away from the dominant stories that you're seeing around you. Like there's this dominant story that everyone hates their job. So why try something different? At the end of the day, everyone has this jadedness about what they do for work. But you're so right that there's also this other dominant story that like I'm gonna follow my intuition and be a digital nomad and like wander the world for the rest of my life. Like we have a lot of extremes that are presented to us, whether it's through friends or social media or even just like the vision we have for ourselves where we do want that instant gratification. And I think it's okay to casually plan for how you want to manifest your intuition. I really love how you phrase that because I remember sharing with people that I was going to make this transition a few years down the road, and they're like, "Oh, how do you wait that long? Or how can you like plan for something so far ahead?" And I think you just really have to choose your hard. Like, what version of hard do you want, and are you willing to put up with? Because the time's gonna pass anyways. Like, you might as well spend that time in a way that feels meaningful and aligned with your life. And that those few years of planning also gave me this life jacket when things would get really boring or frustrating or stagnant. I'd be like, this isn't the end goal. Like there's something on the other side of this. And so I think that act of planning and also writing your own story, not feeling like you have to be in one extreme story or another, is really important.
Absolutely. And it's kind of like that saying that people will just say off the cuff, like Rome wasn't built in a day.
Yeah,
Marathoners just don't run a 3 hour marathon in a week.
yeah.
I call it personally like horizon syndrome. I like suffered from that
Oh,
for
I
a
love
little
that.
while, where
Yeah,
constantly being on the other side of the fence, or when I have that thing, when I have that job, I'll be happy, or I'll be financially stable, or I'll be this. And it's until you learn to be comfortable and thrive in the area that you're at, even if it's just looking forward to your morning coffee, literally whatever it is, you have to really enjoy where you're at, because if not, it will just become crippling for sure.
totally. What do
Yeah.
you think created that shift for you?
My sister is a really big inspiration for me, and that she is like a multifaceted woman, very artsy, but also works in tech, and says what she means, and does what she says. And so, for someone like her to be a model in my life, you can
Yeah,
really just see that, not someone that like does it all, because like I don't think we all can always like do it all, but someone
yeah.
who is just like, I am this and I am that, and both of those things exist, and I'm cool with it. And
That's
so being
incredible.
Yeah, she's a badass. And I know when she listens to this, she'll probably cry. So shout out to Nina. I love you.
Oh, we love you, Nina.
Yeah, she's great. So you mentioned a word that stuck with me in your response, which was extreme. So can you just talk about the extreme transition from being in the tech world to being a
Mhm.
therapist?
I was a customer success manager in the tech world, so I would manage client accounts after they had signed contracts with my company, and the accounts could be anything from like $20,000 to $500,000. And I was working with a lot of really big brands, and it was kind of fun in a way that I got to be on the inside of these brands and get to know the teams that make these big names up. And it was also a little challenging because I think I had an inner therapist that was more interested in the family dynamics of this VP of finance than trying to convince people to expand their contract or buy more
Yeah.
licenses. And I think there's room in the world for both because if I hadn't been trained and coached by a lot of incredible women, by the way, in the tech world, um, I wouldn't have been able to develop professionally and have the confidence and the self-sufficiency that I have now as a therapist. But I was always noticing the parts of my experience that were like these little anchors, like getting to know customers on my accounts, trying to send them small gifts on special occasions just so they knew I was thinking of them, trying to use my professional role to build community and not have these transactional relationships with people. And I always had some sort of passion project related to mental health. At my last company, Udemy, I started a mental health employee resource group. And resource groups were really big during COVID, especially because they were ways for employees to come together over something they shared, like an identity of being parents or a passion for mental health. And it was so cool because it was just a little side project I did, and it completely took off. And I got interviewed by Forbes. It was a really
Wow.
crazy, yeah, it was a really crazy thing. And I think that gave me the validation that, like, there is a way for the resources and exposure of tech to coexist with mental health. So I'm really excited to see what direction that industry goes, especially now there's a lot more mental health tech companies. Um, but I think for me, a lot of my skill set as a customer success manager of like being able to manage different platforms, being able to adapt to different personalities, um, being autonomous and self-sufficient, but needing that authority figure when I have a question or I need like a thorough explanation of something. It was so incredibly helpful for me as a therapist because the barrier to entry of like managing uncertainty, quieting my imposter syndrome, reminding myself that like I am competent, I do have these skills, it came a lot more naturally because of the boot camp I went through in the tech industry. And I think also the contrast of like tech work not always feeling fulfilling was a really great jumping off point for entering therapy because it's a hard road to be in grad school and to wait for your license from the state and to navigate all the bureaucracy of the therapy industry.
Yeah.
But I could feel when I was in the room or when I was doing therapy with someone how connected I was to them and to the world and to myself. So I think it is helpful for us to have these environments where we're surviving because they provide that really necessary contrast for when you're thriving. And if you don't have the two, it's a lot harder to appreciate the thriving.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Well said. I have no follow up because that was amazing. With your a section of your population, how do you see like mental health changing in women in their 30s in this really like thriving, becoming who they are era that we're in?
Yeah, yeah, that's such a great question. Well, I was curious if you noticed that like turn around the corner in your 30s, like with the addition of therapy. Did you feel like something was different for you when you turned 30?
Yeah, so I turned 30 April of last year, and actually on the podcast episode with my sister, we're very close, and I had kind of said like I feel like I pulled my head out of the sand a little bit. I think that
Yeah.
I'm around a lot of people who are engaged, are in very serious careers or getting serious promotions, and
Hmm.
not that I like have or don't have those things, but it's easy to compare, but then also wonder where you see fit, or if that's the right way
Right,
to say it. It's easy
right.
to wonder where you fit, like in all of that and what that means for
Such a
you.
great point.
I think my 20s was just a lot of having fun and figuring out and shooting off the side of my hip, and loved it and hated it in a lot of ways. But I've really turned into a lot of inner serious self development. So therapy has really helped with that.
I love that. And I think it's also really self-aware of you to have developed your identity along the way, and then also to develop it in parallel to the people around you, like the relationship with your sister or the things you're seeing in other women your age. And I think that's something that I've seen a lot in terms of the connection between mental health and women in their 30s. Um, we live in a very individualistic culture. And so sometimes we forget that we develop through community, through our relationships. And so I often think about the role of community and relationships for women in their 30s and what that means for their mental health. Because you're absolutely right. Like, we're now in this fishbowl where we're seeing everyone's milestones all the time, like
Hmm.
getting married, having kids, moving, buying houses, changing jobs, etc. And I think that's a really important mirror for us to gauge where we're at and question things, as you mentioned. But I think even with relationships, that resonates for me, what you said about like the 20s being a bit of this exploratory phase where like you love some things about it, you hate some things about it. I definitely resonate with that. And I think I had also been a little more carefree and reckless in my 20s. And by the time you get to your 30s, I and like a lot of my clients have had the same kinds of relationships or the same kinds of friendships so many
Hmm.
times that we start to turn this corner of like, do I want these kinds of relationships for the rest of my life? Like, do I want to date someone that talks down to me? Do I want to be friends with someone that doesn't share my values? There's something that happens in that shift around 30 where you start to make decisions that are more zoomed out regarding the rest of your life and not just being so in the moment the way you were in your 20s. Um, and I think another thing I'm also really noticing is that once women are in their 30s, there seems to be more of this capacity to slow down. Whereas in our 20s, everything just feels like a scramble.
Yeah.
Like, we're adjusting to life after college, which that's a whole other topic in itself. Like, I've seen a lot of Gen Z people have this identity crisis after college because they don't know who they are or what comes next. And then we're having fun, we're going out, we're partying. A lot of people's relationship with alcohol and substances is different in their 20s than it is in their 30s. And so I think we're just like going, 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 trying to figure out who we are along the way, like putting the wheels on the car as we're driving it.
Yeah.
And then in our 30s, we start to slow down a little bit. And that slowness is okay with us. Whereas in our 20s, a lot of people just want to like go, go, go. Um, so I think slowness is probably the most important thing I talk about and try to help my clients cultivate. Because when you can take this stance of slowness and just pause, reflect, zoom out, these are the ways I help my clients make choices based on their values or their intentions, and not choices that are just spontaneous or based in the moment the way they are in our 20s. And it's been really rewarding work because my clients will say something, and these are like women in their 30s, and I'm like appearing neutral outside, but inside I'm like, hell yes. I'm like
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
excited for them because I know what it feels like and it
Yeah.
resonates. But on the outside, I'm like, I am a neutral therapist with no personal opinions.
Yep. Oh my gosh, that is so funny. You're like, and how does that make you feel? Oh,
Yeah.
that's a great reflection.
Yeah. I'm sure a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
Um, and you mentioned that like zoom out, that's such a healthy way to describe it
Yeah.
because you really do zoom out in your 30s and there is a lot of zooming in your 20s. You're in college or fresh out of college and it's very much
Right.
what is right in front of you, which is
Right.
not good, bad, or indifferent. It just is. It's objectively what it
Right.
is and where a lot of people are in their life. So
Totally.
when women are entering their 30s, what kind of tips or advice or insight would you share with someone who feels like quote unquote stuck on that like zoomed out phase?
Oh, I love this question so much. What I find interesting is that when my clients feel stuck or feel like they don't really know who they are, the style of therapy I was trained in, narrative therapy, is so helpful for this kind of um, existential crisis, because narrative therapy is all about zooming out, like being able to not just look at your life today or this year, but really as a full story and ask yourself, like, where did the story start? Where is the story going? Are there parts of the story I would like to rewrite? And I noticed that there isn't really the encouragement, at least not in our culture, for people and women to develop this really strong internal identity where they know who they are, they know their values really clearly, they
Hmm.
have consistent community throughout their lives. I think there's a lot of individualism, there's a lot of instant gratification, and there's also this tendency to base who we are on external things, like
Yes.
to base self-worth on the validation of a relationship, to base our definition of success on the material possessions we have. And so, unsurprisingly, people get to a stage in their lives where they're like, I actually don't know who I am, and I feel stuck, but I don't know why. And so that's where we do this rebuilding work, where I ask them, like, what are your values? Like, what are the things you care about in
Hmm.
life? What are some of the practices that inform who you are? And I literally whip out a list of values.
I love that.
And yeah, and so we go through the list and people are like, "Oh, I guess yeah, accountability is important to me. Creativity is something I loved as a kid, but I let go of that as an adult."
Yeah.
And so when they have their values, I think they have a clearer picture of like how to define themselves from the inside. And then I also do a lot of emotions work. And I've noticed that so many mental health conditions are exacerbated by us being disconnected from our feelings, especially because in American culture, I think it's common to respond with thoughts. So I'll ask my clients, how did that make you feel? And they'll be like, well, I think she did that because this is how she is. And I'm like, but how did it make you feel? And
Yeah.
they're like, well, I know I need to be patient, da 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 da. And I'll be like, and so in that case, I'll pull up an emotions wheel and I'll be like, I want you to pick an emotion, not a thought. And it's so hard, but it's just like uh example of how we tend to live in our thoughts. And the more you're in your head and the less connected you are to your emotions, the more often people feel stuck because they don't know what's happening inside. And so sometimes I'll play a game with my clients and I'll say like, well, if we didn't have the word stuck or if we didn't have the word lazy in our language, how would you describe what you're feeling? And when they look at the different like emotions wheel, maybe there's regret that they let a certain job go, or maybe there's anxiety that they're in this one city, but they want to move somewhere else to a city that might fit them better. So, yeah, I do a lot of values work. I try to keep outside influences outside. Like, let's define who you are from the inside and not by these external influences. Um, and then we do emotions work so that people are more connected to their emotional experience on a daily basis.
That's crucial in therapy for to be able to, differentiate what you're dealing with. And I love the classic, I have to point out, I love the classic therapy feeling wheel. That is like
Yeah,
so cliche. That is like so cliche, but and it
I
sounds
know.
so like juvenile almost, but it's real. How many people have neglected and gone their whole adult life, without identifying really like what they feel and like what that
Right,
emotion is. And it's not, it's, I say juvenile in a way that it's like maybe something that we're expected to learn at the age of 5, but it's not. Like
right,
this is an
right.
ongoing process. Maybe you were deprived of it at the age of 5 and that's why you
Yeah,
couldn't do it then. Um,
totally.
but it is like such a really important thing. And the inner work is crucial to self-development, and the inner work zooming out is amazing. I love that.
Totally. And I love that you bring up the emotions wheel being cliche because if you feel it's cliche, that's how you know you've invested a healthy amount of time in therapy.
Yeah.
And for a lot of my clients, they've never seen it before. Like I whip it out and they're like, whoa, what is this? Because we reach a point where I want them to say an emotion other than angry, sad, tired.
Yeah.
But our emotional vocabulary, as you said, is so limited. And it also, I think, reflects on the generation before us. Like,
Yeah.
I think a lot about, even though my mom was an immigrant, I think she's part of this generation that didn't really care about thriving, was more about surviving, and emotions were an afterthought. They
Yeah.
just did what they needed to do. And I know for my mom in particular, emotions were very compartmentalized because she just had to keep going as a single parent. So I think our parents didn't necessarily have these tools or these words to describe emotion, and we inherited some of that. And then when we have the opportunity to be in therapy, it's such a privilege to have access to those tools and to see those visuals and be like, oh, I can have this other emotion called frustration.
So transitioning into, often I think we kind of know that the generation before us is maybe quote unquote against therapy. What
Hmm.
is some advice or wisdom that you would share with someone who is interested
Yeah,
but nervous about it? And what would you share with them or like the benefits of it?
that's a great question. Because at the same time that I love therapy and I would hope everyone would try it at least once, I also recognize that therapy can be a construct. It's this artificial construct where someone sits with you for 60 minutes, they pay you money for the things you say to them, and hopefully they feel better at the end.
Yeah.
And you try different things with them to help them feel better. And that format doesn't always work for everyone. I know in Middle Eastern culture, like both sides of my family are Lebanese from the Middle East, there is this really beautiful practice that when someone comes to your house, you make them Turkish coffee in this little like Turkish coffee pot. And then you have the little like traditional coffee cups, these like tiny little cups. And
Yep.
you make this big pot of coffee and you sit together and you just drink out of those little cups until the pot's empty.
Oh,
And
wow.
during that time, you're talking about everything: family, relationships, worries, dreams, whatever. You're laughing, you're feeling this sense of support. And to me, that is quote unquote therapy. it's just a cultural difference of like what it looks like. And so when people say like, "Oh, I don't believe in therapy, but I see my friends consistently. I
Hmm.
have some movement practice, whether that's exercise or walking. I'm part of this meditation group. I have a spiritual life." I'm like, "Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
That's great. You're taking care of all the dimensions of your wellness, like social, physical, spiritual, emotional. However, I do think it's important that people try therapy at least once because there is something about dedicating that hour to yourself. And I
Yeah.
think people are starting to see it as self-care or to see it as like vitamin work instead of medicine work. Like
Hmm.
therapy had this stigma where you only go if you're quote unquote crazy or suicidal or you have this like really big event that's happened in your life. And now people see it as like a form of maintenance and
Yeah.
self-exploration. Um, but in particular, I have found it interesting that a lot of straight men are resistant to therapy, but because of the suggestion of a woman, like whether they come to couples therapy or whether their partner asks them to go to therapy individually, or whether they have a female friend who's a therapist that's like, "Oh, you should see someone."
Yeah.
They're getting nudged into therapy after saying they never would. And I think that's incredibly important because I have noticed this trend that like straight men don't have a lot of places where they can relearn healthy masculinity and be
Hmm.
vulnerable at their own pace. So
Hmm.
for them, yes, you have to go to therapy. But for everyone else, it's fine. Do what you want to do.
You mentioned that there's other ways to kind of engage in therapy practices, working out, something like a book club or hanging out with your friends or whatever it may be. Recently, I've heard in conversations with friends that there is a term called like therapy fatigue, therapy burnout. What do you think of this, and kind of how would someone recognize that they kind of hit that point or maybe need a break from it?
Well, I think there's one sort of therapy fatigue that I've seen where, like, sometimes clients might go too deep too fast. And I actually do see this sometimes with straight men because they haven't always had a space where they can be as open as they'd like about their feelings. And so, in some cases, it can be like floodgates where they're
Yeah.
just letting out a lot of pent up emotion. In other cases, I have some clients with like more complex trauma
Hmm.
where we have to tread really lightly because you might feel like you want to share everything or every detail about this traumatic event, but when you're talking about it for like 45 minutes straight, you're not leaving enough time for your body to decompress and for
Yeah.
you to like let that memory go before you go back into the world after your therapy session. So I think the first piece of advice I have for that kind of fatigue is to just go slow, like go at your own pace. Um, Ask your therapist to ask you questions.
Yeah.
I think sometimes there can be this tendency with therapists to like smile, nod, listen, and that's a great starting point. But we as therapists need to be curious and proactive when people are speaking so that they don't feel this pressure to just vent for 30 or 40 minutes. And at the end, they're like, well, I just vented. I didn't connect any dots or I didn't feel any insight.
Hmm.
Um, but I think the other thing too is that when our nervous system lets go of this weight it's been holding, it is normal to feel tired.
Yeah.
Like if you've had this story within you that's been so heavy or burdensome and you're letting that story out, um, it sounds weird, but like a form of relaxation for your nervous system is to feel tired because you expressing that story and putting yourself back in those emotions is a form of energetic release. And so, in the same way that, like, sometimes when you're with someone that you really care about, like a friend or a partner or a family member, you feel tired,
Yeah.
it can also be a sign of like safety that like you feel safe enough or you've released the stress of like earlier that day before you were with this person and now your body feels like it can just let go and
Yeah.
relax.
Yeah.
Um But for the other topic you mentioned, where you might come to therapy and you feel like there isn't a lot to talk about, um, I usually in my early sessions with clients, I'll ask them to list the different areas of their life that have been challenging or disruptive. And then every week I have them score each area and we work based off of that. So if you're scoring your financial stress like a 10 and
Yeah.
it's really stressing you out that week, we talk about that. On a different week, if you're scoring your social life a 1, meaning like it's really good, we also talk about that. Like, what is it that you're doing that's making
Mm.
things go well? Because
Hmm.
if we're only analyzing the problems, then therapy becomes a problem practice. But when things are going well, that's also worth examining because there are things you're doing that you may not have been doing before that is resulting in you not having anything to talk about in therapy. So, like, even you not having anything to talk about is something to talk about. I think if you start to feel this, like, huh, actually, I think I'm fine this week. That might be a sign that it's time to take the training wheels off and
Yeah.
go back out into the world with what you've learned. But those final sessions with your therapist, even if it's goodbye for now, not goodbye forever,
Hmm.
those final sessions are so important for you to name the things you've learned so that you know what skills you gained and you can lean on that knowledge in the weeks you don't have therapy as you like move forward and graduate
Right.
from it.
It doesn't have to be this one size fits all that everyone just goes weekly because that's not the reality. And that was a learning curve for me too,
Totally.
that you actually can be okay and fine for 3 months and then text them and say, like, hey, I got a new job and I'm really struggling and this is coming up for me and this fear of failure and I'm having anxiety. Can we meet and talk about that? And that's okay too. There's like that squiggly line saying, like, it's not a straight line.
You also bring up a great point that like therapy takes many forms, not just like in the room with your therapist, but I always question my clients that want to meet once a month or once every like 2 or 3 months. And I ask them, why is it that you need therapy for this space? What is it about your life that we need to build? Or what kind of relationships do we want you to seek out where you're
Yeah.
not relying on seeing this paid professional once every 90 days to fully share your thoughts or to fully be yourself? So I think there's also an interesting question to pose there that, like, what are the sources of support in your personal life that extend the value or the skills you've learned in therapy?
Oh, that's amazing. And what I'm hearing you say too is self accountability.
Yes. Self
Huge.
accountability, yeah, like for clients, but also for therapists. Like as a therapist, I'm open to my clients' preferences, but I also have this secret goal of making myself useless.
Yeah.
Like if I can teach my clients, it's a very weird job that I'm in the business of like human nature and making myself useless, but if I can teach my clients to like build healthy enough relationships that they don't have to lean on therapy once every 3 months or every other week, then I feel like I'm doing my job helping them expand what we learn outside of our 1 hour together. And you're also reminding me that, like, by us enabling people to take those skills and not need us, we can also make space for the other families that need us or the other clients that need us because there is a mental health shortage that
Yeah.
I've seen people talk about a lot. Some of it is because of the pandemic, but some of it is because it's really damn hard to become a therapist. There's so many hoops to jump through. There's a lot of financial risk involved. And so I think part of our work in being ethical with clients and helping them expand their knowledge is so that we can also make space for other people to work with us versus only seeing the same person every week for like 5 years. Some people need that and prefer
Yeah.
that, but some people I think are hesitant to move away from the comfort of that relationship. And that's where, as a therapist, we also have to practice accountability and encourage our clients to see themselves in their best light beyond working with us.
Oh, that's mic drop. That's amazing. Jenn, I want to thank you so much for being on the Surthriving podcast. We covered everything, being a tech worker, going into therapy, doing a 180 career change, and the power of therapy, how to engage with your therapist and engage with yourself and self-reflection and all the important things of how therapy and mental health can really make someone thrive versus survive. And any last words of insight, wisdom that you would like to share with our listeners?
I think slowness and practicing pausing is something that you can do today without a therapist in front of you. And I've seen that be like truly life-changing for my clients. So that's my final nugget.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your wisdom, for the time that you have spent sharing your story and insight with us. I'm so excited for our listeners to feel inspired by this. So thank you so much
Yes.
again for coming
Thank
on.
you so much, Lisa. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Surthriving. I hope you took some helpful information away from it and are feeling inspired. If you know someone who is surviving or thriving and would benefit from hearing this episode, feel free to send it over to them. Remember, sharing is caring. To leave a review or rating of the show, head to Spotify to follow, rate, and let me know what you think. All information about today's episode, guest, and podcast social handles will be in the description, so don't forget to follow us on social media to stay up to date.